I woke up in the middle of the night with a weird feeling. 27 years in the military, and I'd never felt anything like it. Maybe it was a premonition. The silence at the barracks at 3 in the morning usually brought me peace. But that night was different. I straightened my spotless uniform, ran my hands through the graying hair at my temples, and took a deep breath. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sullivan, 45, respected by everyone at Fort Benning. A man of rules, discipline, and routine. Leave a like if you also believe that life can completely change when you least expect it. My routine was as predictable as the seasons. I always got up at 4:30 a.m., ran 5 miles before sunrise, supervised the morning drills, inspected equipment, and, between strategic meetings, kept order in the 3rd Battalion. The Georgia air had a peculiar smell at that time of year, a mix of damp earth, metal, and the fuel from military vehicles. The barracks were the only home I really knew, even more than the empty house I kept for the occasional visits with my wife, with whom I'd shared 20 years of a marriage that existed mostly on paper by then. From my office, I could watch the new recruits in the training field, sweating, determined, some completely lost. The Army had been my whole life, but lately I found myself wondering if there was something more. The gray walls of the barracks, decorated with medals and certificates, told the story of a man who had followed all the rules, until that night. It was during the surprise nighttime inspection when I entered the Alpha Platoon's dormitory. Everyone was asleep except for one. In the last bunk, Recruit Carter was sitting, reading something by the dim light of a flashlight. When he saw me, I expected to find fear or shock. Instead, he smiled. And then, something that had never happened in all my years of service, he winked. A gesture so subtle and so quick that for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. "Recruit, turn that light off right now," I ordered, using the most commanding tone I could muster. "Yes, sir," he replied, but without any hurry. There was something in his eyes. A challenge, perhaps. The next day, during field exercises, I watched Carter even more closely. 24 years old, in great shape, performing above average. There was something about him that piqued my curiosity. During the obstacle course drill, our eyes met several times. Each glance felt like a small electric shock. Dinner in the mess hall that night brought another level of tension. Carter sat a little apart, but his eyes never left me. When I stepped out for my nighttime walk around the perimeter, it wasn't a surprise to find him near the vehicle depot, secretly smoking. "This is against the rules, recruit," I said, stepping closer than I should have. "Lots of things are, sir," he replied, extinguishing his cigarette on the sole of his boot. "Doesn't mean it's not worth the risk." There was something in the air between us. A tension that went beyond military hierarchy. It was dangerous, improper, and completely against everything my career stood for. I should have reprimanded him harshly, maybe even reported him. Instead, I found myself saying, "Meet me behind the M1 tank in 20 minutes, no witnesses." As I walked to the meeting spot, a million thoughts filled my head. What was I doing? 20 years of marriage? Almost 30 years of an exemplary military career? All on the line for... what exactly? But I couldn't stop. Something inside me, something that had been asleep for decades, was finally waking up. That's when I noticed a shadow moving among the buildings. Recruit Mason, known as Warrior for his intensity and training, seemed to be watching. Had he seen our conversation? Did he know about the meeting? A knot formed in my stomach. My reputation, my career, everything could crumble in just a few hours. I waited in the shadows, hidden by the imposing silhouette of the M1 Abrams. The war tank looked like a giant asleep under the silvery moonlight. Every second felt like an eternity. Every distant noise caused my heart to beat faster. That's when I felt someone behind me. "I thought maybe you had changed your mind," Carter whispered, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his breath at the back of my neck. "I still can," I replied, turning to face him. In the dark, his eyes shone with an intensity that completely disarmed me. Carter didn't show any of the nervousness I was feeling. Instead, he had this confidence that I couldn't help but envy at that moment. He was only a few inches closer than military protocol allowed. "You should go back to the dorm, recruit," I said, trying to regain some control of the situation. "This is crazy. Crazy is denying what we feel, sir," he answered, taking another step toward me. "I've been watching you for weeks. The way your eyes follow me on the training field. The way your voice changes when you speak to me." I wanted to disagree, but the words just wouldn't come out. Carter raised his hand, hesitated for a second, and then touched my face. The contact, almost imperceptible, sent waves of heat through my body. 20 years serving in combat zones had never made me feel as vulnerable as that simple touch. "No one needs to know," he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of my jaw down to my neck. When our lips finally met, it was like a dam had burst inside me. Decades of self-discipline and control vanished in seconds. My hands found his waist, pulling him against me with an urgency I didn't know I had. The kiss was fierce, desperate, as if we both knew that this stolen moment might be the only one we ever had. The cold metal of the tank against my back contrasted with the heat radiating from his body. He was all firm muscles and warm skin beneath the rough fabric of the uniform, and every inch of him seemed magnetized to me. My hands explored his body with a hungry curiosity, discovering new territories I'd never even thought about conquering. "I always imagined what this would be like," he confessed between kisses, his husky voice in my ear. "But reality is way better than any fantasy." In that hidden space among the war machines, we gave into a different kind of battle, a fight against years of repression and denial. Our hands unbuttoned our uniforms with urgency, sliding over exposed skin, mapping every muscle and curve. Time seemed to suspend as our bodies became familiar with each other, first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Carter guided me as if he'd studied a detailed map of my body. His hands knew exactly where to touch, where to press, where to caress. When his lips trailed down my chest, leaving a burning path on my skin, I closed my eyes and surrendered completely to the sensation. It was as if every nerve in my body woke up all at once after decades of hibernation. Under the silent watch of the stars and shielded by the darkness, our bodies intertwined in an ancient dance. Every move, every touch, every sigh seemed perfectly orchestrated. When we finally became one, it felt like something inside me had been completed. A piece I didn't even know was missing finally found its place. The ecstasy hit like a storm, overwhelming and unpredictable. I clung to him as waves of intense pleasure took over my body, washing away any trace of guilt or regret. For those brief moments, I wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan. I was just a man discovering a part of himself that had been asleep all his life. Later, we got dressed in silence, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was like the quiet after a hard-fought battle, exhausted, yet satisfied. When he fixed the crooked badge on my chest, his fingers lingered for a moment. "Same time tomorrow?" he whispered, with a confidence that almost made me smile. "We'll see," I replied, trying to regain some authority, even though both of us knew I'd be there. As he walked away, I noticed movement in the shadows again. The warrior. My blood ran cold. How long had he been there? What had he seen? Panic began to rise in my throat like bitter bile. I didn't sleep that night. Every possible disaster scenario ran through my mind. Mason was known for his strict discipline and his respect for the rules. If he reported what he saw, my career would be over. More than that, it would be a disgrace. 27 years of exemplary service erased by a single moment of weakness. The next morning, I watched Mason during training, looking for any sign or hint of what he might do. He remained impassive, carrying out each exercise with his usual precision. Carter was there too, keeping the proper distance, but every now and then his eyes met mine, rekindling memories of the night before. I decided I needed to act. I'd wait until Mason's night guard shift and confront him directly. Better to face the situation than live under the constant threat of exposure. Night fell slowly, every minute dragging on like hours. When the clock finally hit 11 p.m., I headed to the guard post at the north end of the perimeter, knowing Mason would be alone there. I found him standing, rifle on his shoulder, eyes vigilantly scanning the darkness beyond the fence. His body tensed a little when he noticed me coming, but he didn't turn around. "Sir," he nodded to acknowledge me, keeping his eyes fixed ahead. "We need to talk, recruit," I said, positioning myself by his side. "About what you might have seen last night." A heavy silence settled between us. Finally, he turned to face me. His face was unreadable in the dim light. "I saw enough, sir," he replied, his voice neutral. I braced myself for negotiations, veiled threats, or even pleas. Anything to ensure his silence. But what he said next completely caught me off guard. "I've always admired you," he began, lowering his voice slightly. "Your discipline, your dedication. But last night," he paused. "Last night I saw something different. I saw a man following his desires despite the rules, despite the consequences." I swallowed hard, unable to figure out where this conversation was heading. "And that made me admire you even more," he concluded, his eyes now fixed on mine. That's when I realized there was no threat in his look, only desire. The same desire I saw in Carter's eyes, maybe even more intense, more contained. My breathing quickened involuntarily. "So, what exactly are you saying, warrior?" I asked, deliberately using his nickname. "I'm saying that I'd like to be a part of this," he replied without hesitation. "Not as a blackmailer, not as a threat, as a participant." The proposal hung between us, loaded with possibilities and dangers. Part of me wanted to back off, to end it all right then and there, and return to the safe path of conformity. But another part, the part that had awakened the night before, was already considering his words. "Tonight, at the abandoned observation post near the shooting range," I suggested, surprising myself with my boldness. "Bring Carter." Mason's eyes lit up with anticipation. "Yes, sir." As I walked away, I felt a dizzying mix of fear and excitement. What I was doing was even riskier than the night before. It wasn't just a moment of weakness anymore, it was a deliberate choice. A choice that could cost me everything I'd built. The hours until the meeting blurred into a haze of anxiety and anticipation. I kept checking my watch, imagining different scenarios, planning escape routes in case someone discovered us. It was like planning a military operation, except the goal wasn't a strategic victory. It was something much more personal. The abandoned observation post was perfect, isolated enough to guarantee privacy, yet close enough not to raise suspicion about our presence in the area. When I got there, the place was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd changed their minds, or worse, that it might be a trap. Then I heard footsteps approaching. Carter and Mason emerged from the shadows, arriving together as we had arranged. In the moonlight, their young, determined faces made me question if what we were about to do was wise. But when Carter smiled, the same confident smile from the night before, all my doubts melted away. "I thought maybe you had given up," Carter said, echoing his words from the previous night. "I still can," I replied, though the smile on my lips betrayed my words. Mason was more serious, more reserved, but his eyes revealed the intensity of his anticipation. He maintained perfect military posture, as if he were still in formation. "Relax, warrior," I said, once again using his nickname. "Here, we aren't officers or recruits. We're just three men." Something in my words seemed to break him. His shoulders visibly relaxed, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability on his usually controlled face. Carter noticed it too, and naturally, he moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. What started as a light touch quickly escalated. Carter, with his characteristic confidence, pulled Mason toward him, their lips meeting in a passion that surprised me. I watched, fascinated, as the two of them explored each other with increasing urgency. Uniform against uniform, youth against youth. When they finally broke apart, they both looked at me, expectation and desire plain on their faces. They were no longer simply subordinates waiting for orders. They were equals, inviting me to join them. I stepped forward, giving in to the moment. What followed was an experience that transcended anything I'd known before. Three bodies moving in sync, discovering rhythms and combinations I never thought possible. Hands, lips, bodies intertwined in perfect harmony, as if we had been rehearsing that intimate dance for years. Carter was all fire and impulsiveness, his caresses intense and direct. Mason, on the other hand, revealed a surprising gentleness, every touch deliberate and caring. And I, caught between these complementary extremes, experienced pleasure on levels I didn't even know existed. When we finally reached climax, one after the other like successive waves on a beach, we collapsed together on the floor of that abandoned post, breathless and satisfied. The silence that followed was filled only by our gradually returning breaths. "That," Carter murmured after a while, "was better than any mission I've ever done." Mason chuckled softly, a sound you rarely heard from him. I completely agree. Lying there between them, staring up at the faded ceiling of the observation post, I felt a strange kind of peace, as if an internal war I'd been fighting for decades had finally come to an end. There was no longer a battle between duty and desire, between appearance and essence. "So, what happens now?" Mason asked, always the strategist thinking about next steps. "Now we go back to our lives," I replied, as reality slowly set back in. "We act normally, we follow protocol, and we meet again," Carter added, not as a question, but as a confident statement. I smiled in the darkness. Yes, we meet again. In the weeks that followed, we developed an elaborate system of signals and schedules. Carefully planned meetings, each time in a different place. As our confidence grew, so did our boldness. The constant risk of being discovered added an extra thrill to our encounters. In public, we kept the proper distance, the military hierarchy intact. I was the strict officer, and they were the disciplined recruits. But when the doors closed, when we were safe from prying eyes, the ranks disappeared, replaced by an equality based solely on desire and what we shared. During those meetings, it wasn't just physical pleasure we experienced. We talked, shared stories, and revealed parts of ourselves that we kept hidden from the rest of the world. I learned that Carter dreamed of starting his own business after the army, while Mason had ambitions of staying in the military until the very end, inspired by a grandfather he never knew. In turn, they learned about my failed marriage, the loneliness of years in command, the regrets I carried. Our confidences became as intimate as our physical encounters. It was in one of those moments of shared vulnerability that I realized what we were building went beyond the physical. There was something more, something that scared me more than even the possibility of being found out. I was starting to care about them, developing feelings that went far beyond simple desire. When Carter received orders for a transfer to another base, the impact was greater than I expected. The news hit like a bomb during one of our weekly meetings. "Fort Hood, Texas," he announced, avoiding my gaze. "I leave in 2 weeks." Mason, always the most controlled of us, couldn't hide his disappointment. I tried to intervene with the schedule, but it would have raised suspicions. We tried to keep things light that night, but our intimacy took on a different tone, more desperate, more intense, as if we were trying to make up in advance for the impending absence. Later, as we got dressed in silence, Carter finally said what we were all thinking. "This doesn't have to be the end." I looked at him, surprised by his persistence even in the face of an imminent separation. "Leaves, days off, there are ways," he continued. "And eventually we'll all be assigned somewhere. It might even be the same place." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that what we had could survive the distance, the complications, the system that worked, often unintentionally, to keep us apart. But military reality was relentless, and I knew it too well to let my hopes run wild. "We'll keep in touch," I said, a vague promise that sounded hollow even to myself. The night before he was set to leave, we met one last time. It was different from all our other meetings, slower, more meaningful, every touch, every kiss, every sigh filled with an emotion none of us were ready to name. When we said goodbye, Carter surprised me with a request. "Take care of the warrior for me." His gaze shifted from mine to Mason's, and I saw in it a depth of feeling that went beyond our physical arrangement. "And take care of each other." After he left, Mason and I continued to meet, but there was a noticeable emptiness. We tried to fill the void with more intensity, more frequent encounters, but the dynamic had changed irrevocably. We were now an incomplete equation. It was during one of those meetings, about a month after Carter left, that Mason asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What are we exactly?" he asked, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. The question hung between us, heavy with implications. What were we, really? Lovers? Friends? Something that the military vocabulary had no word for? "We're men who found something special," I finally answered. "Something we never expected to find, especially here." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my vague response. But I knew the question would linger between us, unresolved until we had the courage to face it head-on. Now, looking directly at you watching this video, I realize I've shared more than I originally intended. This isn't just the story of 3 men defying the rules in a controlled environment. It's the story of how I discovered a part of myself I didn't know existed, of how I learned that human connection can show up in the most unexpected places. If you've made it this far, you might be wondering what happened next. Did Carter come back? Did Mason and I figure out what we were? Did we manage to keep our secret? Well, that's a story for another day. If you want to know more, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. There's so much more to share about journeys of self-discovery, risks that are worth taking, and moments that change our lives forever. Because in the end, it isn't the rules we follow that define who we are, but the chances we take when nobody's watching. Or at least, when we think nobody's watching.